Hello everyone, welcome to today's luncheon talk. We have the pleasure of having the Ambassador for South Africa, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. The Ambassador is South Africa's Ambassador to the United States. Before joining the Embassy, his most recent positions have included Member of Parliament in the National Assembly, Special Advisor to the State President of the Republic of South Africa, and Premier or Governor of the Western Cape Province. Ambassador Rasool is a prolific speaker on a range of topics covering politics, governance, religion, Islamic and cultural themes across the world. He received a Bachelor of Arts and a Higher Diploma in Education from the University of Cape Town. He's married with 2 children, and please join me in thanking and welcoming the Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emre, for what you do and what you mean for all of us here in Washington, D.C. and the United States, for the Rumi Forum and its work, and bringing the gentler values of a great person to bear in probably a center of the world where decisions are often between life and death, choices are often between military and dialogue, and I think that we need in very much a way in which we can appeal to the gentler side of people, in which we can appeal to the softer values that I think all human beings want to hold up to. It's in that spirit that the South African Embassy has particularly been actively engaged in bringing a 3-meter high statue of Nelson Mandela to Washington, because we believe that there's universal admiration for the way in which he constructed a settlement, negotiated a settlement, fashioned compromises, and we think that it's a contribution in much the same way that you bring Rumi to life. And I'm not trying to say that the two are equivalent, but certainly I think it's a humble contribution that we make. I've been preparing for a colloquium that we are convening in Paris over the Easter weekend of Muslim minority leaders, that we are drawing from about 20 countries across the world to enter into discussion. And we've done it under a very provocative theme, which I have asked Emre whether I could use yourselves as the guinea pigs for it. Living where you don't make the rules. Because in all the things that we can discuss about the Muslim disquiet, especially where there are minorities, I think we often miss it. We call it all kinds of names. We call it Islamism. We call it radicalism. We call it extremism. We call it fundamentalism. We call it violence. We call it conflict-driven communities, all of those kind of things, and they all probably have a semblance of truth in all of them, because they display on any given day some of those characteristics, but they don't tell the story about what its causes are, and therefore don't even begin to describe how to deal with it, how to manage it, and how to bring peace to the soul of a community that is often uncomfortable in the context, and their discomfort in turn invites fear, invites suspicion, and often hostility. So somewhere we've got to decide on the chicken and the egg. Where do we deal with this problem? And so the way in which I've understood it is that this is a community whose theological assumptions have been made in times of dominance, when Islam was an empire, when Muslims were the rulers, when they reached out to Spain. They made theological assumptions about how they could live. They created the rules for how they engage with those who were non-Muslim. They set the tone of the lifestyle that will be led by them. And suddenly You've got a few million Muslims in South Africa, a few million Muslims in the United States, a few million Muslims all over Europe, hundreds of millions of Muslims in India, etc., etc., and they are not the majority. They are not dominant. They are not the empire. They don't have a Khalif. And so the idea of now living with a set of rules and precepts and not being able to live by those rules is probably one of the most unsettling things. It fundamentally makes people feel that that they are not respected for being given off when the call to prayer is made, that they are not respected for having to work over a lunchtime on a Friday when they should be in mosque, not being respected for the dress codes that they've inherited, not respected for the things that they must eat, which are halal, etc., etc., not respected in terms of people insisting on shaking women's hands and all of those kind of things. And so this becomes an unexplainable phenomenon that manifests itself often very emotionally. And that is why this concept of living where you don't make the rules, how do we help manage that? But it's not a monopoly of Muslims to live in a world where they don't feel respected, where their rules don't count, and where they don't even have the closeness to power in order to set it. And I think we live in a fundamentally uncertain world. And we could either rail against that uncertainty or we could embrace it. And I was very fascinated in the Masnavi when the great Jalaluddin Rumi says, sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. Because I think it speaks to us. Sell your cleverness, your ability to know all the answers, your ability to be certain, your ability to plot a graph of how you will progress, your ability to know things. Sell that cleverness and buy bewilderment. Learn to enjoy being bewildered. Learn to embrace the uncertainty. Give up the black and white areas of life and enter the gray area and muster all the creativity and the innovation, all the fascination of not knowing where the route is. And then Rumi doesn't just say, by bewilderment. He doesn't leave us up a creek without a paddle. Because he also then says to us, as you start to walk out on the way appears. It is often when we are afraid of the dark and we then get trapped in what we know. We're afraid of the unknown, and so we only want to be with those who look like us, eat like us, think like us, pray like us, and dress like us. But the moment, as Rumi says, you actually set out on the path of the unknown, the path begins to appear. It doesn't appear to those who want to see it from a safe haven. It doesn't appear to those who know they must be on the path but are afraid of the first step. It only appears when you embrace bewilderment and you let your curiosity get the better of you, and you begin to build the courage in order then to go out on this path. And so how do we apply those very profound philosophical precepts in the life, not only as it appears amongst this group of minority leaders that we will meet over the Easter weekend and try to teach them how to live with bewilderment, how to be fascinated by the unknown, how to embrace the gray areas. How do we, all of us, who through the condition of the world, through globalisation, have all had to cede some of our knowledge, some of our certainty, some of our power, some of our decision making, some of our rules. We've all had to really cede autonomy and sovereignty Because we live in a world that has produced more wealth than ever before, more growth than ever before in the history of humankind, and yet has had the unintended consequences of greater poverty and greater inequality. We live in a world where there's so much technology, but often at the expense of the natural world, of the environment. We live in a world where there is so much information and knowledge available at the click of a button on your phone. You can access any information, any knowledge. And yet, we've often had it at the expense of traditional systems, traditional knowledge, faith-based knowledge, culture, and the things which have been the anchors in the life of people all along. And so suddenly entire faith communities have every supposition on which they've based their life being questioned. Every value that they thought were valuable suddenly appears less valuable. And we live in a world where capital and goods are instantly mobile. You can press a button now and $1 million can flow from one continent to another continent. You can get your things on a plane. We put fresh fish onto an aeroplane in South Africa and serve it in London 12 hours later. And yet, when people are mobile, when people want to follow capital, when people want to follow goods where they are in abundance, we don't know what to do with the mobility of people. We call them immigrants. We call them migrants. We call them aliens. We otherize them. We make them the other. And so this world, which holds at the same time so much promise, so much potential, so much wealth, so much material things, at the same time, it is a world which drives so much uncertainty, so much fear, so much hopelessness, so much despair, so many mental problems. And it breeds mindsets. And so coming back to the point that I made earlier about living where you don't make the rules, I don't think fundamentally, when I look at the group of Muslim leaders from minority contexts who will gather in Paris over the Easter weekend, when I look at them and I listen to them and I engage them, I don't think that they are fundamentally different to a group of Christians in the charismatic tradition, or a group of ultra-Orthodox Jews, or a group of business people who also don't understand the world as we understand it, or environmentalists, or any other group. I think that the world today is less divided by the formal categories of Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jew. It's less divided by ideology. It's divided by mindset. Because the response to this uncertainty in the world is threefold. There are those who retreat into orthodoxy, what they know, what has been given to us by tradition, what we've inherited from our forebears, from our ancestors, the thoughts that were packaged in our exegesis, in our analysis, in our interpretive books. On the other hand, and so those are the people who retreat into the mosques, who want women to be what they've always been. These are the people who want to bring up their children as they were brought up, despite the fact that their children have more information at the age of 10 than they've had at the age of 50. And so the siren song of orthodoxy is very tempting. But our priests and our imams and our rabbis And our leaders know when they sit in the church, the mosque, the synagogue, that the congregation is getting older, that the youth are diminishing, that you are speaking to the last generations of people who will hold on to this orthodoxy, who will find credibility in it. The inability of orthodoxy to give answers to the world today in any discipline, any religion, any ideology has created an impatience on the other extreme. That's where people have become fundamentalist. That's where people have become extreme. That's where people's idea is that they will not live where they don't make the rules, they will fight to make the rules. They want to destroy the status quo because they can't live where they don't make the rules. It doesn't allow for tolerance of difference. They must destroy difference. It doesn't allow for a tolerance of the other. The other must go. The other must either be like them or the other must go. And it comes up crudely in places where they place car bombs for Sufis or for Shias. It comes up in sophisticated debates on television screens about immigration. And so, whether it's sophisticated, whether it's crude, it's the same thing. It's the extreme response to it. They have certain things in common amongst themselves. What is the difference between a Muslim fundamentalist, a Christian fundamentalist, a Jewish fundamentalist, an economic fundamentalist, an environmental fundamentalist? They label because they can't debate. They kill because they can't embrace. They die for a cause because they don't know how to live for their cause under changed conditions. And so, in a very real way, we have the two extremes, an orthodoxy that is in inertia. It can't move forward and can't move back. And you've got a fundamentalism that is nihilistic. It's destructive. And so the question for us, who find ourselves in the middle, who constitute this middle ground, is how do we embrace the unknown? How do we live where we don't make the rules? How do we every day go about being bewildered, but unfolding that path that Rumi speaks about? How do we help by going onto the way to show the way? Not knowing the way, but discovering it and telling people it's safe here, it's okay here, it may even be very nice here. Because you're discovering different people, you're eating different foods, you're seeing, as Rumi also says, the same sun lighting up different worlds in different ways, but the sun is the same. That Christians may not prostrate as Muslims do, but whatever they do to the same God. How do we send out a signal of the safety of the unknown? That there's nothing to fear in it, but there's lots to discover in it. And so, part of the tools of living where you don't make the rule is to find more identities than the one you cling to. And so in South Africa, Nelson Mandela allowed, for example, Muslims in South Africa to say, I'm a Muslim. And then to say, but I'm a South African Muslim. And I can go further to say, I'm a South African Muslim of Malay origin. And then I can go further and I say, I'm a South African Muslim of Malay origin who watches Manchester United play soccer. Those are identities that don't compete, they complement, they add to you, they don't subtract from you. Being a South African does not subtract from being a Muslim. Being of Malay origin does not subtract from being a South African. Supporting an English soccer team does not subtract from being a Malay. And so how do we teach people to live with multiple identities rather than to live or die by one? And that's what is the fundamental fault line on both sides of us. On the orthodox side and especially on the fundamentalist side. They want you to live or die by single identities. And we've got to break free. The first rule of living, where you don't make the rules, is about embracing different identities, because then you see yourself connected to more and more people in the world. When you say, I'm an American Muslim, you're not only connected to the 5 million Muslims or whatever the number is in the USA, you are suddenly connected to 350 million other people who also say that they are Americans. When you recognize that you may be an American Muslim of African origin or Indian origin or Arab origin, you can enjoy all the food that comes from those origins, all the cultural joys of it, but most importantly, you also then say, what I enjoy as an Arab, Turkish, Indian, African, I want to share with 350 other people who I believe will enjoy it when they see it, taste it, experience it, or feel it. The second principle of living where you don't make the rules is really one which says you've got to embrace multiculturalism. In the world we live in today, monoculturalism decays. Monocultures decay. We now know that the great growth spurt in Islam was when Muslims encountered non-Arabs. When they went to Turkey, we suddenly produced Suleiman the Magnificent. When they went to Spain, we built the most tolerant society in Andalusia that the world had ever seen. When they went to India, they created architectural and cultural wonders when they encountered others in India. It is when those former multicultures become monocultural that they decay. In much the same way that the USA was at its most creative, at its most vibrant, at its most dynamic, when all these different cultures were colliding every day, were interacting every day. It's when former multicultures then become one, then want to find an overarching, but not only overarching, but sometimes an overbearing single culture and a single identity, that you lose your edge. You suddenly slip behind in mathematical figures, slip behind in innovations that you register, slip behind because you need the different minds, the different eyes, the different ways of looking at things, the different ways of thinking about things. You need that constantly to reinvigorate. And a large part of the inertia in Islam is because, in a sense, we have stopped colliding with other cultures. And we need other cultures. And that's why every time you can see the points. When Islam collided with Africa in Fez, they produced the first university. When it collided with Africa in Timbuktu, it produced manuscripts of enormous learnings and philosophies. When it collided with Africa at Al-Azhar, it produced the world's third university. It's when it stopped colliding with others in wholesome ways and started to collide with others in destructive ways that it began to contract, not in numbers, but in ideas, in civilizational impulse, in the production of literature, in the production of culture. And so, in a very real way, we've got to embrace this multiculturalism because monocultures decay. The third rule of thumb for living where you don't make the rules is that what you wish for yourself when you are powerless, you must be able to provide when you are powerful. You can't cry for a mosque in New York, but not give a church in Saudi Arabia. How? It's consistency that you've got to be able to stand by, because you've understood that unless you are consistently good, that the sword cuts both ways. If you don't open that door to others, you open later the door of intolerance to yourself. When temporary powers change, when temporary majorities become, or temporary minorities become majorities. And so in a very real sense, what you want for yourself, you've got to give to others. And not make up all kind of philosophical and theological gymnastics to come out of that obligation. It's got to be clear-cut. And so this is the path of bewilderment that I think that Rumi invites us to. How do we allow ourselves to be bewildered and to act on the purest instinct that is within all of us? And if we follow that purest instinct, we will do the things that are right. We will do the correct things. And then we don't need rules. It will be negotiations. It will be the kind of thing that South Africa has really, I think, in the modern era taught the world, that words that appear weak when we are materially flushed, negotiate, is denoted as weakness. Compromise is seen as weak. Dialogue is seen as something that weak people do. I think that what we need to do is to invest those concepts with its innate strength. We've seen the power of all of those three things in South Africa at work to make the transition from apartheid to democracy. Wherever I go, people admire it. But they don't just admire it, they give it a name. They call it a miracle. They don't just love Nelson Mandela, they give him a name, they call him a saint. And I challenge them. And I say, no, we don't want you to see South Africa as a miracle and Nelson Mandela as a saint. Because what you are doing is you're copying out. You are adding a divinity to blunt what was human agency. Because when you make something divine, you put it out of reach of yourself. You then say, Nelson Mandela was so great. He fomented a miracle. And what does that mean? It means then that I can't do that. When I confront my neighbor that has angered me because his dog did something on my lawn, that I can't forgive him. If Nelson Mandela could forgive those who put him in jail for 27 years, what's the problem between you and your neighbor and your dog? You see, but when you sanctify it, you abrogate your responsibility to do the same thing. And therefore, I think what we need to do on a regular basis is to enjoy this bewilderment, because it leads us to a wondrous path of being able to negotiate, being able to dialogue, and being able to make compromises on a daily basis. If we could make fundamental compromises in a country like South Africa, and we still live with the aftermath of it, but we manage it every day. So I thought that maybe those were just some thoughts, fairly loosely, that I wanted to share with you. Maybe I was over provocative in putting it in front of you, but hopefully that provocation will lead to a healthy interaction. But thanks very much for listening, and thanks again, Emre, for facilitating this.
We can take questions from the floor. Sir.
Stefan Richter with The Globalist. There is very little to disagree on many fronts. When you look at the question of respect that underlies it all, I wonder whether the flip side on minority status, leaving religion and all of these things aside, isn't that these minorities still have an illusion of the power of power? The reason why I say that, another intellectual in this town, Moises Naim, is peddling and showing off his new book, The End of Power, where he argues across many fields, corporate, government, and so on, that actually those in power, A, delude themselves if they think they have a lot of power, and B, that they yearn to have the power that is assigned to them. So I wonder whether the only additional element in your wonderful edifice of thought that is already perfectly complete, it seems, is whether you could address the question of the illusion of power that the majority has. Now, surely in some crude societies it is still brutally exercised through police and so on. But I think an important element is that if in the high altar West, that power is shrinking, maybe last in the United States, but in Europe, for example, the power of the banks and a lot of the structures that used to run societies, executive compensation and so on, is reined in democratically and brutally in a positive way. It leads to a lot of dispersion of power. Isn't that the one element of your message that still needs to be blended into that thinking? Thank you.
I think it's probably the most difficult element to blend in. I agree with it. I think that there are countries that can run and do run despite their governments. I think that sometimes the disillusionment we have with presidents and leaders is precisely because even when they think that they are very powerful, there's a machinery that runs despite them. There is a track that a country is on that can't be altered, except over a very, very long term. And so you're right, there is the illusion of power, but it's often replaced by the trappings of power. And so you need more bodyguards to assure you that you are in power. Your convoy needs to grow longer to make you feel that you are in power, because it's the observer is deluded and the subject sets out to delude, because you almost in a sense need the contract between the deluder and the deludee, that we will pretend that there is a power at work, because you don't also want to disabuse the deludee about the powerlessness of the power, because what do you leave them with? But I think that unless we can get this kind of deep Rumi understanding about the power of bewilderment, then you can replace both the trappings of power and the real exercise of power. I think people really are not absolutely ready yet to countenance a powerlessness. I'm just afraid that people may do pathological things with their despair. And so that's why I don't articulate it as forthrightly as what you do. I rather invite people to this path of bewilderment in order for us to embrace how to live where we don't make the rules. So it's a very clever way. And what I recommend for it, when people are minorities, can easily apply to those even who are majorities, to live where you don't make the rules. Because on a daily basis, how do you make the rules that you feel that you need to make? So I would agree, but I would just be a lot more careful myself in articulating that, because then we really leave people up a creek without a paddle.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador, I was just wondering what you see the role of education in this. If you go to my Facebook page, for inspiration, I put Mandela, and I put Pablo Neruda, and I put Antonio Machado, who said, "Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar," which is exactly what you're talking about when we talk about path. That happens, I believe, because I've been around educating or getting education in different places. Not as I would have wished in my own Sahel, Niger, where I learned the Quran, reciting it without knowing what I was reciting. So perhaps minorities have also that problem in different places, as we know. What would be for you the role of really education in what you're saying? Is it possible to have, in South Africa, say, an education whereby we all would go through a path that talks about belonging and being together, rather than what we're having elsewhere, where it's also separation? Perhaps the fear comes also from there.
Could you also kindly introduce yourself, sir?
So again, oh, sorry about that, because you said ambassador. So my name is Ambassador. My name is Maman Sidikou. I'm the ambassador of Niger to the USA. Thank you.
Just so everybody knows. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellency, I think that that probably is one of the very important questions about the role of education. I think that all of us, and Africa is probably as much in danger of doing it, are chasing very hard outcomes for education. We all have seen the utility of education, that at the end of 12 years, we want our children to enter into higher education. At the end of those 4 or 5 or 6 years, we want them to be something with a hard skill. And so education has become utilitarian, both in outcome and in input, meaning that we're now teaching children only the hard things that they really require to get something in life. And so what has eroded from education, and I'm not saying that we should be teaching civics and sex education and life skills, because those are the little add-ons. I think when you have the add-ons to education, you are trying to compensate for something that you know is missing. What is missing has to be added in. It's about values. And yet I think that probably all of us who profess values will not be able to agree on what are core values that must permeate an education system and a pedagogy. But somehow I think that we need to find each other on an agreement of some values that every religion, every culture, every ideology can hold dear. And you've volunteered a few of them. It's the sense of belonging, it's a sense of togetherness, it's this coexistence, and so forth. I think we need to have, because there's nothing more that we can really do about the hard skills that education teaches. Before, when I was growing up, calculus was only done at university level. It's now going down younger and younger into children. I can't help my children with it. So the hard skills are getting a lot more advanced. It's the soft things that we are missing in education. It's the sense of values. And I'm making a clear distinction between morality, which is often do's and don'ts, and values and ethics, which is a kind of compass that they have to guide the hard skills. That you can be a great doctor, but it's the compass that brings the empathy. You can be a great engineer, but it's the internal compass that asks you, how will I put the lighting so that women can walk at night? And so I think that's the point that I think is really missing. And we've got to distill that from the life of Mandela, from the life of Martin Luther King Jr., from the life of Mahatma Gandhi, from the life of Pablo Neruda, and all the others that you have that you have mentioned and really see whether we have been given something that can go. So I'm not knocking the hard skills that education gives. I'm not asking simply for life skills to be added on. I'm saying that there's something missing in that I think we need to open a debate about.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, when you talk about mindsets, and the question is how the mindsets are shaped, and in the interaction between the global South and North, with the recent remarks of President Zuma about this lingering neo-colonial attitudes, which I think is very to the point, the question is, how does the South and South Africa as a leading force in the South could rise to create the institutions needed to compete effectively in this global marketplace of ideas, to stand up, to the think tanks, many of them in Washington here, and in the communication realm, and in the film industry? And how could we develop a partnership between the South and those of us in the North who may be considered the natural allies, those of us who put our lives on the line to get Mr. Mandela out of jail, to resume this partnership in a sense, decades later, to advance this this necessary partnership for shaping ideas?
No, thanks very much. I think that that the issue of both competing and being a partner, maybe it's more possible today than for the last century that we can even conceive of a North-South partnership, a partnership between superpowers and those who are developing. And I think that a lot of, as my colleague from Niger would be able to say, a lot of our diplomacy from Africa is particularly predicated on the fact that we have never seen the US as vulnerable as it is now. Not weak, not in decline, but vulnerable. For the first time, they are crying in the US about 8% unemployment. 30% is a condition of life in South Africa. For the first time, they are worried about the beginning of homelessness. Homelessness is a condition of life. We almost think that the table is laid, and Europe particularly is going through of its most difficult times. Suddenly, they decry austerity when we have lived with poverty. They can't manage the austerity in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, all over Europe. And yet, we have lived endemically with poverty. And so, I think the table is laid for empathy. I think for the first time, we can come to the table at a moment when a country like Africa, or a continent like Africa, is the second fastest growing region in the world. We can say, let's enter into this partnership, because your salvation lies in entering into wholesome relationships with Africa. We are willing to share, but not occasion a scramble again. And so I think it's ironic that we have this discussion on the eve of the BRICS summit that will be hosted in South Africa, and to which all African heads of state will also be, and we're thinking there about the BRICS Bank, so that the development projects that we need across Africa and across the South will be able to be funded by the BRICS countries who have 40% of the world's reserves for the first time ever. 15% of the world's economy. For the first time, we are going to discuss at the BRICS summit the idea of a BRICS think tank. Because we can't be angry with the world about neo-colonialist and paternalistic attitudes. We've got to think our way out of this. And so the idea of a think tank becomes absolutely critical. And so I think that we are simultaneously laying the basis both to compete and to partner. And I think that that some of the things that will happen at the BRICS summit, I think, takes us a long way towards that objective.
Is the lady on my right in white, please, Jenna? Again, if you could kindly introduce yourself, we would appreciate it for the benefit of the speaker and the audience.
My name is Stephanie. I am with the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. And Your Excellency, I wanted your second principle on embracing multiculturalism struck me because 2 years ago, approximately 2 years ago, Angela Merkel declared multiculturalism had failed in Germany. And I know other European countries are struggling to integrate and adapt new populations into their what have been monocultural populations. My question is, was it a problem of not believing that it could succeed or the application of success? And if they do not embrace multiculturalism, what is going to become of those countries?
Yeah, I think that it's been fairly popular for European countries to declare multiculturalism as dead. You see, there are three options for creating coexistence or for living together. The one that happens by default is what I call isolationism. It's when Pakistanis move from Pakistan to Britain and they all go and live in Birmingham. And they live in the same neighborhood. They have their spice shop around the corner, their mosque is around the other corner. They have the dance or the Qawwali group in another corner and so forth. And everything they do happens within in that part of Birmingham, to the extent that recent immigrants don't even need to learn to speak English because they can access everything in Urdu. And that happens when you don't plan for people coming in. When you resist it mentally, you also resist it spatially. And so you set up these ghettos of communities who look the same, eat the same, pray the same, and talk the same. So that's the one extreme that hopefully we can get the world to embrace this multiculturalism, to embrace the fact that the other will be in your space and to plan for it. The other extreme is the French model of assimilation. You come into France, you leave who you are at the border, and you become one of us. You leave your religion and its symbols, you leave your language, you leave your Algerianness, and all of those kind of things, and it now defines a new version of Frenchness, of Britishness, and of Americanness. Now, if I look at the population of Britain, then I wonder, what is Britishness? When I see Jamaicans, and I see Indians, and I see Pakistanis, and I see South Africans, and I see Africans, and so forth, your definition of who you are must also begin to reflect. It can't be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant any longer. You've got to redefine who you are. And so when assimilation doesn't work in Germany, then the immigrants aren't good anymore because they're resisting to become German. What we have worked on in South Africa is to find the third variation on that theme, and that is integration. Now, in our sloppiness of language sometimes, we use integration and assimilation interchangeably. Assimilation has at its core to become the same. Integration has at its core integrity. And integration works when the integrity of the whole is respected and in turn respects the integrity of the part. Meaning that Muslims in South Africa must respect the integrity of the South African nation to be a sovereign nation, to be a good nation, and to be a coherent nation. And in turn, they get respect for the integrity for them to be Muslim, to pray and to do this and to eat halal food, etc. So we need to shine a greater light and pierce the obvious meaning of integration and find its deeper meanings and act accordingly. Then we set up the recipe for wholesome coexistence in society. And the test, when I spoke to the Muslim community of Germany, largely of Turkish origin and so forth, I said to them, the test I set myself, for example, is, can I earn my money in South Africa and owe my loyalty elsewhere? Can I give my children everything they need in South Africa, but mentally still be a Indonesian or a Javanese, as was the case 300 years ago? And another test is, if my country were legitimately in conflict with someone else, would I fight for it? And when you can answer those hard questions, you know whether you have assimilated, isolated, or integrated.
Ma'am, you had a question?
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser, and I am involved with a number of NGOs, nationally and internationally. One resource that I think can be very helpful in your vision.
Ma'am, can you speak into the microphone?
I don't know if it's...
It is.
It records. It's for the purpose of recording.
Okay, fine. The work of many professional associations that have international links are very much oriented to the kind of things you think about. For example, in the engineering community, there's an organization that looks at engineering and ethics. In the United States, there's an actuarial society which is very concerned with ethical issues that face people that deal with billions of dollars in insurance. And at the international level, these bodies meet and they do influence practitioners in these fields. So it seems to me that's a world that would be very helpful for you to interact with and know about, because they can help direct people to seeing the linkages and the transcending values that they have in common. So I think that there are forces that are working toward these issues in many different spheres.
I think that's heartening, and I know that architecture begins to reflect it, etc., etc. I just think that we need to mainstream it so that, because there are other ways, not just in the professions, but there are other ways that we require far more wholesome children, far more in our education system to infuse those values that have those broader application, where it is not simply the ethics of a profession, but human ethics that I think prepare them for it. But I agree absolutely with you that I think that some people are seeing, but we also have to salvage, and I'm not saying that this is the case in the examples you use, but a lot of companies are seeing the commercial sense of going green. It's not inside, it's on top. And the market will be absolutely important in changing attitudes. But the fact of the matter is that I think it doesn't preclude us from engendering it in the kind of education system. And that's why a debate about values in education becomes absolutely critical, but must be separate from religion in education and morality in education, because that has a whole lobby of its own.
We have one last question I have time for. Thank you.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. You know, it's very hard to disagree with multiculturalism, as you pointed out. It is. And since you mentioned India and the Muslim culture and so on, I wish the integration was far more peaceful, and therefore, I guess one of the things you should emphasize in your presentation is lack of violence and peaceful methods, because I mean, United States, since the Second World War, has been a leader of the world, and it has gone into more wars, and when leaders go into wars and killings, it kind of is an open season for everybody. Everybody says, hey, if this guy can do it, we can do it. So the reduction of violence or ending unnecessary wars should be one of our biggest goals. Would you agree?
Thank you.
No, I think similarly it's hard to disagree with what you're saying. I thought rather than decrying war and violence, which I think is what many of us when we come together do, I wanted to invest power in aspects of negotiation, of dialogue, and of finding compromise. Because I don't think that there's a shortage of people who decry violence and war. But there's a shortage of people who are actively working to invest those concepts with power. We've got to rescue it from a thing of powerlessness. And that is why we think, for example, that we are helping to close a golden triangle in Washington, D.C. by bringing Nelson Mandela here. Because down the road from us will be Mahatma Gandhi, and on the mall is Martin Luther King Jr. In a very strategic way, we're trying to triangulate the decision makers of Washington with three people who have been able to show the power of satyagraha, of passive resistance, of peaceful, active. You see, for me, I belong to a Muslim organization in South Africa that affiliated to the Liberation Movement. It was called the Call of Islam. And we set out, given the fact that we were up against an evil called apartheid. We did not say that we are pacifist, because how long do you remain passive in the face of evil? We did not want to use any of those kind of things. What we did say, and I must get it right now because it's a long time since I've used it, we were determined to be militant but not violent, to be radical but not fundamentalist, and to be revolutionary but not extremist. Now there's a fine line between those, and we were actively searching for the one side, because we recognize that those who have peace as their objective are often seen as the wimps in the room. And sometimes the challenge you're facing doesn't require wimpishness. It requires militancy, but not necessarily violence. It requires radical change, but not of the fundamentalist variety. It requires a revolution, but not an injection of extremism. And we think that it is possible. And that is really, I think, the challenge of our time, but the gift of King, Gandhi, and Mandela.
It would be better to have Mandela rather than Genghis Khan. There was a proposal to have Genghis Khan.
Okay, on that note, may I thank the Ambassador. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Rasool. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.